Please turn your Bibles to Daniel, the second chapter, and we would like to read verses 31 through 35. Daniel 2, 31 through 35. You, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome. This image's head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You watched while a stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay, and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed together and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. Excuse me. The wind carried them away. Excuse me. Apologize. The wind carried them away so that no trace of them was found. And the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Excuse me. As required by King Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel here reveals the dream to the king, which is the text that we have just read. I suggested to you in our last lecture that Nebuchadnezzar probably knew what the dream was. He had not forgotten the dream, as we might think, as we may have been taught in Sunday school or through reading Bible storybooks. I think that he remembered it, because verse 46, then King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face, prostrate before Daniel, and commanded that they should present an offering and incense to him. What a response. Daniel reveals the dream and interprets the dream. And just as soon as Daniel hushes, Nebuchadnezzar falls on the floor in front of Daniel, worshiping him. This is very dramatic. Kings generally don't fall on their face, prostrate to their servants. While the interpretation of the dream may have overwhelmed Nebuchadnezzar, his falling on his face before Daniel signals to Daniel that the dream that he described is exactly the dream the king had. That, I believe, is what sparks this kind of response from Nebuchadnezzar. Remember the Chaldeans? They had interpreted his dreams before, after he would tell them what they were. This time, he was being shrewd. He wanted to know if they could. And they couldn't tell him what the dream was. But here is Daniel. Tells him the dream and the interpretation. And Nebuchadnezzar is overwhelmed. This response is like Nebuchadnezzar saying, that's exactly the dream that I had. Remembering what the Chaldeans had said in verse 11, there is no other who can tell it to the king except the gods, in whose dwelling is not with flesh. The king here falls on his face as an act of worship, supposing Daniel to be a god or some kind of divine being. And then the king catches himself and remembers what Daniel told him about the God in heaven who reveals secrets. Do you remember that? So the very next verse, verse 47, the king answered Daniel and said, truly your God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings, and the revealer of secrets, since you could reveal this secret. So he's overwhelmed because Daniel tells him the dream. And his first thought is, oh my goodness, he must be a god. He falls down, catches himself. No, you told me there's a God in heaven who reveals secrets. So I'm not going to worship you, Daniel. I'm going to respect your God. Now, the interpretation of the dream. The king has seen an image that depicts 4 kingdoms that will rule over the earth, will rule over the people of Israel until the coming of Messiah. Keep in mind that's what this dream is all about. 4 kingdoms that will rule over the people of God until the coming of Messiah. There are those who will put a millennial interpretation on this. Others will put interpretations that go into the gospel day, our time, or before our time. But that's not possible to the interpretation. It all has to do with the 4 kingdoms that rule over the people of God until the coming of Messiah. Matthew Henry comments on this. He writes, "This is a history, but it is the history of a prophecy. The 4 monarchies and the concerns of Israel in them, and the kingdom of Messiah, which should be set up in a world upon the ruins of them. This image represented the kingdoms of the earth that should successively bear rule among the nations and have influence on the affairs of the Jewish church. 4 monarchies were not represented by 4 distinct statues, but by one image, because they were all of one and the same spirit and genius, and all more or less against the church. It was the same power, only lodged in 4 different nations, the 2 former living eastward of Judea, and the 2 later westward." So here you have comment by Matthew Henry, making sure that we understand that this is a prophecy of history relating to kingdoms that would rule over the Jewish kingdom until the coming of Messiah. And he points out that the dream was in one image, not 4 different images. You might think, well, if there are 4 different kingdoms, why didn't they have one image for each one of them? Well, Matthew Henry points out because they had really one purpose. They had the same spirit, and that was to rule over the people of God until such time Messiah would come. And as we go through not just the interpretation of this image, but in the other prophecies in Daniel, we will see how these kingdoms ruled over the people of God, how they treated Israel. And let me tell you, there's some very nasty things that were prophesied in those prophecies. Now, this first part of the image is a head of gold, which Daniel says is King Nebuchadnezzar. The second part is the kingdom that will follow Nebuchadnezzar, and it's made of silver. And this part of the image was the chest and the arms. If you have your church bulletin from this morning, you can see the statue there and how this is bearing out. The third part is the kingdom that follows the silver kingdom, and it is made of bronze, or if you're reading the Old King James Version, it says brass, and consists of the belly and the thighs. The fourth part is the legs and the feet of this statue. The legs are made of iron, and the feet of mixed iron and clay. And this kingdom crushes all the other kingdoms so that there was nothing left of them. But finally, this dream shows a stone striking this image at the feet, and thus breaking the entire image in pieces. Quite a dream. That's what Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar. That's the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. And when Daniel told it to him, he says, "You're right. That's what I dreamed." Now, the dream is no good unless it is interpreted. So we want to begin interpreting this dream. The head of gold. Daniel interprets it in verses 37 and 38. He says, "You, O king, are a king of kings, for the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. And wherever the children of men dwell, or the beasts of the field and the birds of heaven, he has given them into your hand, and has made you ruler over them all. You are this head of gold." Nebuchadnezzar is identified with this head of gold. However, the symbolism signifies more than just Nebuchadnezzar. Okay? It says he is a king of kings. He is a universal monarch. He is the highest king on earth at this time in history. There's no greater king than Nebuchadnezzar. There are other kings, but King Nebuchadnezzar is ruler over more land and over more peoples than any other king on the face of the earth. He rules over the largest kingdom or empire up till this time in history. The head, well, Daniel says is Nebuchadnezzar, is more properly a symbol of the Chaldean or the Babylonian Empire, which is and was at this time the oldest continuously existing ethnic and cultural identity on earth. There's no peoples older, no kingdom older than the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, at this time in history. It began in the second generation after the great flood. Ham, you remember Ham, don't you? The son of Noah. Ham was one of the survivors of the flood. He had a son whose name was Cush, who was also the father of Nimrod. So Ham, Cush, Nimrod. And in Genesis chapter 10, verse 10, we read, "The beginning of his kingdom," and that's Nimrod's kingdom, "was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar." This goes way back in time. This goes back thousands of years before Daniel's time. There was a Babylon. There was this place in this land of Shinar where Nebuchadnezzar was. Some identify Nimrod with Sargon the First, or Sargon the Great, as he's also called, who was a Semitic leader who, in the 24th century BC, established Akkad in southern Mesopotamia as his capital. He subjugated the non-Semitic peoples of Sumer, and by his own claim, extended his rule from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. It is in this land of Shinar where a city was built and a tower erected to serve as a one-world church. It was here that God intervened and confused the human languages. Genesis chapter 11, verse 9. "Therefore the name of the city is called Babel." Okay, you remember that story. Now they wanted to build this tower, a temple, reaching into heaven. Probably not meaning that it's supposed to be so tall that it would reach to heaven, but at the top of the tower it would have the zodiac, the signs of the zodiac, the constellations. Okay? That's really what that means. And God sent judgment. Keep in mind, the world, all the peoples of the world at this time spoke one language. I seem to recall that this happened 75 years after the flood, if I'm not mistaken. Okay? So you had a few people on the face of the earth, probably several thousands, tens of thousands people in 75 years. And they all spoke the same language. And God sent judgment on all the people for this defiance of his rule over mankind. And he confounded the languages. people all of a sudden couldn't understand each other. And they started looking around and found somebody they could understand, and they just kind of went off by themselves. And it was from this act that people moved away and spread across the face of the earth. Some 18 centuries later, Nebuchadnezzar is the king of the Chaldeans, the king of the Babylonians, during the golden age of the empire, which was from 605 to 539 BC. So here he is. He's the king over the oldest empire, if you would call it that, on the face of the earth. He has the biggest empire on the face of the earth. And he is the monarch at the top of this. It doesn't get any better than Nebuchadnezzar. He said, "The God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory." Nebuchadnezzar received his throne from the hand of God for a specific purpose. There's a long list of kings, Babylonian kings, before Nebuchadnezzar. He wasn't the first one, okay? Going back 24 centuries. But he is the king now. And Daniel says, the God of heaven has given you a kingdom and power for a specific purpose. And this purpose was prophesied before the conquest of Judea by the Babylonians. In Jeremiah chapter 25, verse 9 and 11, Jeremiah says, "Behold, I will send and take all the families of the north, says the Lord, and Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon, my servant, and will bring them against this land, against its inhabitants, and against these nations all around, and will utterly destroy them, and make them an astonishment, a hissing, and perpetual desolations. And this whole land shall be a desolation and an astonishment, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years." This is why God put Nebuchadnezzar as the king of Babylon, to bring judgment on a backslidden people of God. That's the only reason. Nebuchadnezzar had a father who was the king of Babylon. Going back all those times. Just think, when the Israelites came into the land of Canaan and they formed their nation. Have you ever read the book of Judges? What was the one problem that they always had in the book of Judges? Backsliding, idolatry, over and over and over again. And then you have the kings. What happened with the kings? Well, when the nation divided, the northern kingdom was totally given over to idolatry until it was destroyed by the Assyrians. But Judah had this continual problem with idolatry. Judah had some good kings that would make reforms and tear down the high places and break down the idols, and then they'd have a bad king and they'd build back the high places and build back the idols, on and on and on, until finally God says, "Whoa, enough. Nebuchadnezzar, you are going to be my servant." Do you ever think of a bad guy being a servant of God? Normally you don't think about that. But listen, when God has judgment to bring on peoples, He will use someone. And it won't be a nice person. Nebuchadnezzar was a king of kings. He was this head of gold. And if you look at this image, gold, silver, bronze, iron, they get less and less valuable. So the highest value in this whole image is the head, is Nebuchadnezzar, is Babylon. Okay? In Jeremiah 27, verse 5 through 7. I have made the earth, the man, and the beast that are on the ground, by my great power and by my outstretched arm, and have given it to whom it seemed proper to me. And now I have given all these lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. My servant and the beast of the field I have also given to serve him. So all nations shall serve him, and his son, and his son's son, until the time of his land comes. And then many nations and great kings shall make him serve them. As I said, the reason God placed Nebuchadnezzar in power was to bring judgment upon the people of God for their habitual rebellion against God and their practice of idolatry. According to what God told Jeremiah, their exile was to be for 70 years. And when you count up, some 67 years of that was under the kings of Babylon. And then there was enough time for God to secure their release under Cyrus, the king of Persia. So they were in exile, separated from the land of Judea for 70 years. Now you'll notice from Jeremiah chapter 27, verse 7, that all nations shall serve him, and his son, and his son's son, until the time of his land comes. In other words, the golden head of the image would last only through 3 generations of the kings of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar, his son, and his son's son. 3 generations. Nebuchadnezzar was actually Nebuchadnezzar II. He reigned over Babylon from 605 to 562 BC. He was the son of Nabopolassar, who took control of Babylonia from the Assyrians. Okay, prior to this rise of the influence of Babylon, the Assyrians were the bad guys. They're the ones who took away the northern kingdom of Israel and utterly destroyed it. Okay? And so Nebuchadnezzar's father was the man who took control of Babylonia away from the Assyrians. Then, after Nebuchadnezzar, you have his son, Evil Merodach, or Amel Marduk. And I apologize for the way that I pronounce some of these guys' names. I am not an ancient history scholar. I don't speak Sumerian and Chaldean and like that, so I'm just an American country boy, and I will pronounce them as best I can. But Evil Merodach was king of Babylon from 562 to 560 BC. 2 years. His life was so evil and disgusting that his brother-in-law conspired against him and put him to death. Now, he was a pagan king, but his life was so disgusting that his brother-in-law says, we can't put up with this, and took him out. All right? So, he made some certain changes to his father's policies. One of them was the releasing of the Jewish king Jehoiakim after 37 years in captivity. That didn't sit too well with the Babylonian people, especially the priesthood. So he was king for 2 years. He died. Then you have Nebuchadnezzar, who was king from 560 to 556. He is the one who killed his brother-in-law, Evil Merodach. Nebuchadnezzar was the son-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar. And this king had the audacity to declare war on Media. Now, if you have ever taken ancient history, you know about Babylon. You know about the Medes. If you've ever read the book of Daniel, you know about Babylon, you know about the Medes. You ever wonder why the Medes and the Persians destroyed Babylon? Well, it starts here with this Nebuchadnezzar. He declares war on Media. Why? To expand his kingdom. Okay? His father-in-law had the biggest kingdom on the face of the earth. He wanted to do him one better. I'm going to expand my kingdom, and I'm going to go east. I'm going to take in the Medes. And so he fought against the Medes. And in a battle with a certain Median general by the name of Darius. You ever hear that name? Comes up in the book of Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar was killed in battle. Darius may not have personally killed him, but he was killed in that battle against Darius, the general of the Mede army. After Nebuchadnezzar was a man with a long name, Laborasorakard, or Labishai Marduk, who was king of Babylon in 556 BC. If you were paying attention, you saw where Nebuchadnezzar was king until 556 BC. This guy, Labishai Marduk, was king in 556 BC. That's the same year that the king before him died, right? Okay. He was so corrupt that his subjects would not tolerate him, and he was put to death after reigning for only 9 months. That's a bad dude. When the people can't stand him, and in 9 months they just say, enough is enough, and they killed him. After he died, there was a man by the name of Nebuchadnezzar, who was king from 556 to 539 BC. Now this man had a disagreement with the priests of Babylon. The chief god of Babylon was the sun. Nabonidus worshipped the moon. So he was of a different religion than all the other kings of Babylon before him. He was a different religion than the priests, who were powerful people. This created some real serious problems in the kingdom. So he moved. And he spent 10 years of his reign outside of Babylon in an important trade city by the name of Timah in Arabia. He just felt that if I can't have freedom of religion where I'm king, I'll go to Arabia and I'll be king over Babylon, but from Arabia where I can worship my own God. Now, as a king, he is described mostly in negative terms. But unlike two of these other guys, the people did not rise up against him and kill him. While Nabonidus was out of Babylon, he appointed his son to be co-regent. Co-regent means co-king. He was the big king, and his son was the little king. He was king over all of Babylon. His son was king only over the city of Babylon. And this son's name was Belshazzar. You've heard that name, haven't you? Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. Okay, that's Belshazzar. And Belshazzar was king in the city of Babylon from 553 until the fall of Babylon. His father returned from Arabia to lead a military campaign against Cyrus the Mede. Belshazzar was left in Babylon, the city, to defend the capital city of the kingdom. On October 10th, 539 BC, Nabonidus surrendered to Cyrus, and 2 days later, the Persian army overthrew the city of Babylon. This is the golden head of the image. At its height, it had the best king it ever had, which was Nebuchadnezzar. If you've read the book of Daniel, you'll understand, well, Nebuchadnezzar was a pagan, and he had his difficulties with God. He did respect the God of Daniel, and he did respect God's people while they were in captivity in Babylon under him. God placed this man Daniel in a position of authority to serve each of these kings of Babylon throughout the entire 70 years. Now, you will notice that as I mentioned the kings, there were 5 kings and 1 co-regent. But Jeremiah said there would be just 3 generations. So how do you get 5 kings out of 3 generations? Well, because several of them were of the same generation. So Jeremiah hit the nail on the head. From the time of Nebuchadnezzar, there would only be 3 generations of kings until the next event would happen. I know there are people out there that reach into this vision and other visions of Daniel to pull out teachings about the millennium. But if you've ever studied ancient history, and I remember when I was in the 10th grade, studying ancient history under Mr. Dabney, and we studied a lot of these things. You know, going back to the Sumerians and the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Medes and the Persians, the Greeks and the Romans, and so forth like that. When I went to college in my freshman year, under Mr. Neiswanger, took ancient history again. And we studied about these people. It's amazing how smart people can forget the history they have studied to follow after a doctrinal interpretation of eschatology, and how that they can reach back to these prophecies and misuse them when the historical significance of these prophecies is there in plain sight to see. You don't have to be a genius to know this kind of stuff. All you need is a good commentary, and I would recommend Matthew Henry to you if you wanted to. And you need to be able to Google. You can learn a lot about history just by punching in Nebuchadnezzar or any of these guys' names. It all comes up. So as we continue in this study of the image, we will see what Daniel interprets these other parts of this image and how they impact on the people of God. So that concludes this lecture, the second part of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Do come back next time to look at the third part of Nebuchadnezzar's dream.